Carbon Skyscraper. So first things first, let's just talk about what it tells us. It's something that's new that we haven't seen before. So kind of give me an overview, if you will.
Well, the carbon skyscraper, we really worked hard to find the way to make a picture to show just how drastically human activity has changed the situation on Earth. A kind of long history of how much carbon is in the atmosphere, a plot of that has been around for many, many years. It's one of the main graphs in all of climate change. But about a year ago, I, one day had this kind of insight that as dramatic as that other graph was, which really, shows carbon going up and down and up and down and then shooting up in the last couple hundred years, it was really also deceptive. It did not show nearly how dramatic the change really has been, but I realized there was a way to do it, and I was actually inspired by a graphic of employment after COVID hit. I saw the newspaper and it showed like 50 years of employment data, and some years you get some jobs and some years you lose some jobs, and it showed the change every year, and it's going across like this. And then suddenly COVID hits and it just drops. And if you can still think of a full page of a newspaper, they had like 50 years of history just running across the very top of the newspaper. And the line of job loss in the first couple months after COVID went from the top right corner of the newspaper all the way down to the bottom right corner. And it was such a difficult time. It was a devastating graphic, but I suddenly realized, hey, what if we use the same approach for showing how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is changing? I bet it would be just as dramatic. And in fact, it is when you put it on a little bit of a longer time scale. But the change, it's like basically the amount of carbon in the atmosphere century to century, 1,000 years to the next, has been going up and down at the speed of a tortoise. And the change of the last 100 years, it's not even a hair, it's a bullet. Like the change is so dramatic. It's just, there's no way to understand it except that this is what we've caused. It's the only possible explanation.
So of course you're talking about perspective, and whenever we're talking about, okay, we're looking at 800,000 years of data, as opposed to, as you mentioned, 1,000 years of data, where conventional arguments, when you're looking at that short of time span, of course, we see, sure, it's going up, it's gone up and down ice ages, but then you really kind of expand that view, compare to what we've seen, and just see, oh, all of a sudden this isn't we're going up and down and back up, back down. It's just a straight shot up.
Yeah.
And it's just not slowing down.
Here's the idea. People understand there is natural variability in the climate system. The planet's gotten warmer and it's gotten cooler over time. But that doesn't mean that you can't have unnatural variability. And you might say, if you're walking through fields and forests, there's some natural variability, the land goes up and down, and then you walk into a skyscraper, which towers 1,000 feet above you. That's not natural variability. And that's basically what we've done. That's how fast we've added carbon to the atmosphere. You couldn't possibly mistake it for anything natural when you zoom back and have this perspective.
Old school New York City skyline kind of thing. Rise, fall, all of a sudden Empire State Building, it's just straight up and it's right here.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. All right,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Except that, there are a lot of other tall buildings in New York, and in this case, it's more like, imagine a bunch of toddlers standing next to Shaq, right? Like, that's kind of, there's some natural variability. Some toddlers are taller and some are shorter. And then you have Shaq. Like, the difference is obvious.
Mhm.
There's really, that's us putting carbon in the atmosphere.
That's a good analogy. Totally using that. That's very smart and up to date as well. So we talked about a little bit how you came up with it. To dig into that data, though, so far back, of course, we have to talk paleoclimatology, and whether it's trees, whether it's ice in this case as well. I'm talking to another one of your experts, just kind of break that down for everybody too. But even within that past time range that we're looking into, 800,000 year time frame, I want you to kind of explain a little bit how we account for all of that. And also, we talk about measured CO2 and estimated CO2 to kind of account for gaps in the data. How do you even go about kind of getting to do that process, and also ensuring that that data that is estimated is accurate?
Yeah. So we have a tremendous record of direct measurements going back these 800,000 years. And that comes from scientists going to Antarctica and drilling cores, you know, like half a mile deep into the ice sheet. And the deeper you go in the ice sheet, the older the ice is. And we have methods for dating the ice. And more importantly, for dating the air that's trapped in bubbles inside the ice. So you get these really long tubes of ice, you take out a section, it's full of bubbles, and scientists literally slowly melt it away, and then they capture the air in a bubble, and they can assess, it's a direct measurement of the atmosphere of that time. How much carbon dioxide is there? And they can assess what the age is, their variety of methods. Because those ice sheets came from snow falling over hundreds of thousands of years and compacting. So we have a great record of direct measurements, but we don't have them every year. Sometimes, we get a bubble that's in 1 year, and the next bubble is 50 years later, and the next bubble is 200 years later, the next bubble is 30 years later, and the next one is 400 years later. So there are gaps like that. And we used a kind of basic machine learning AI approach to fill in those gaps with a fairly smooth line. It's not really as fancy as that might sound. You might get one measurement that carbon was at, it was at this level, at 1 year, and then it was at this level 100 years later. And we basically are going to assume that in between, it was probably between those two levels, right? We're not going to assume that it jumped up as high, as an airplane and then came back down, because we don't see any evidence of that sort of huge jumping anywhere in the entire 800,000 years of record until just the last 100 years, really. So that's what we do. The reason that we filled in the gaps was because we wanted to see the change in carbon dioxide every 1,000 years. And there wasn't always, an air bubble conveniently located at every 1,000 years. So we needed to have a good estimate for how much carbon was there 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and 392,000 years ago, and so forth. So we had to fill in those gaps, but we were really very much coloring inside the lines to do it.
I think it kind of helps. There might be a little general disconnect with the public as opposed to understanding. You're looking at, the last 1,000 years, that spatial resolution, but then you're telling me that there's another 1,000 years that you might not have data for, that we might be ignoring. And so, quote unquote ignoring, that might be their thought process or their argument there. But there's an important lesson to take home there, is that you're looking for evidence of that carbon increase or anything, even if you're looking in different in that 1,000 year spatial resolution. You're looking that far back, and you're like, humans weren't around here at this time, or we know we weren't doing anything to make it worse. Whereas in the last 1,000 or 100, we know we are.
Yeah, I should also say that we have really good data for the last 60,000 years or so. That is the gaps are really small. The last 100 years, several hundred years, we basically have, well, sorry, the last 70 years, we have data every single year. Then if you go past that, there's data every couple years for a long time. There are no big gaps, no really big gaps until you get, at least 60,000 years into the past. So we have a really good picture of that last period. We didn't really have to fill anything in there. But when you get, when you get back to hundreds of thousands of years ago, there are some cases where it skips like 1,000 years or 2,000 years. It actually almost never happens. Most of the gaps are much smaller than that, but there are a handful of cases of the gap more than 1,000 years. So we need to use this approach to fill those in.
Talk about the toddlers of Shaq. And I think that kind of helps segue into the very first line of what I read of your work, where you're talking about speed kills. So break that down for me. Speed kills. Two very simple words that really kind of just iterate what trouble that we're headed for right here.
Yeah, to put it simply, like a bullet that I'm holding in my hand isn't dangerous. If I throw it at you, it's not dangerous. It's only if you load it in a gun and shoot it at high velocity that a bullet is dangerous. So that to me is how speed kills. Same with a car rolling at 2 miles an hour versus speeding down a highway. It's much more dangerous that way. And so sure, the planet has had a lot of different climates in the past, and it's been warmer than today. We could return to a warmer climate and we could have alligators in Alaska again. Fine. Like that's a world that can be survived by lots of different creatures. But the key thing is, how fast do you get there, right? And if we get there in a blink, nothing is going to have the time to adapt. It means kind of mass death of species and great strain for people and civilization in a way it never would if the change were gradual.
And through the research that goes into your own work there as well, and you specifically mention, you specify that the levels of carbon dioxide that we're talking about here, as those changes happen, I mean, we're at higher levels now than whenever the temperature was that warm, whenever we were 1.2, 1.3 degrees C than we are warmer now. Carbon is higher, which indicates more even in certain scopes, I would say, than just the temperature number itself, and kind of where we're going here.
Yeah, there have been periods in the past where there was more carbon in the atmosphere and it was warmer. But it's also true that the impacts from carbon in the atmosphere and warming today, the impacts we're seeing haven't yet caught up to how much carbon we've added to the atmosphere or how much we've warmed the planet. And a simple way I like to think about that is, if you dumped a dump truck full of ice in the middle of a playing field in the summer, like, it's all going to melt. But does it melt instantly? No, it takes time. And so what's happened so far is we've already warmed the planet by about a couple degrees, but the ice didn't all melt in an instant. It's still melting, right? The sea is still rising. Things are still changing because of the warming we've already caused. And we haven't even seen the half of it yet. And the carbon, once we put that in the atmosphere, unfortunately, a large part of it sticks around for hundreds of years, continuing to heat the planet and cause other vicious cycles that heat the planet even more. So I think that's something that most people probably don't understand. It would be easy to imagine, okay, we transition to a clean energy economy and stop polluting the atmosphere, right, with heat trapping pollution, then the problems will go away. Actually, the only thing that will happen is the problems will stop getting so much worse. but we'll still have the problems with us for hundreds and thousands of years, right? Unless we can suck the carbon back out from the atmosphere, which is a pretty challenging and complicated exercise. So really,
plants. We talked about in a previous climate central work, we were talking about more pollen, longer growing season, everything. We can't just leave it all to that because we don't quite know what that's going to look like.
Yeah, no, it's like changes are, even if we stop polluting tomorrow, we would continue to see change and challenge. Of course, it would be a lot better than the alternative. So when you talk about transitioning to clean energy, it's really all about slowing down the speed of change and buying time so that we can figure out the solutions that we need to kind of live more safely, more comfortably and prosperously. Like all of that's possible as long as the change stays slow. But if it takes off, then really all bets are off. And that, you know, when you see something for 800,000 years, I mean, that's a long time. And it's just been bouncing along, a little up, a little down. Even those little bounces that you see in that graph, those were enough to swing us into ice ages and swing us into warm periods, you know, a whole bunch of times. And then you see this spike at the end. It's kind of unthinkable. Like, where is that going to lead us? So, you know, my hope is that that can really help to grab people's attention and understand just how dramatic this difference is.
Well, and we also talk about carbon parts per million and everything. I believe it was mentioned that the last time carbon dioxide levels were this high were after a meteorite strike, not after anything particularly natural other than that. So last question here, and it's just really the general, you know, of everything that we've discussed over the past 20 minutes. The overall takeaway, what you would like everybody to take away from this, and what's really next, what's necessary here to go forward and to progress forward as safely as we can. We've kind of hit on that just a little bit here and there, but just any of your final thoughts along those fronts.
Well, the bad news is that we've been able to mess up the atmosphere very quickly, and sometimes Mother Nature, the way she responds, we can get into trouble very quickly from those changes. But the good news is we're also capable of cleaning up very quickly, right? Just like there are scary monsters behind the closet that could come out, big change for the worst could happen quickly. I think we could also change from a polluting economy to a clean economy much faster than most people tend to expect. And if we do, right, that's human ingenuity, that's the economy working, it's jobs. And if we make that shift, I think that we'll discover that there are a great many benefits. It goes far beyond the question of not having dangerous climate change. It also goes to having cleaner, healthier air to breathe, quieter cities, right, without the roar of engines all the time. Snow, when it falls in the winter, stays white instead of getting all gray and dark from, frankly, you know, the gasoline we're burning in our tailpipes or coal from coal plants. So no more oil slicks on the bottom of your garage. There are going to be lots of benefits to the transition to clean energy, electric vehicles, and other technologies like improved agriculture and healthier soils and less erosion. The things, we're so lucky because the things that we need to do to keep our climate safe actually have a huge number of other benefits that will make our lives better. And I do think that if we put our minds to it and turn the engine of the economy toward it, it could happen a lot faster than we expect. And that's really the hope, that we can dial back that carbon skyscraper and avert the worst and find we make a much better world in the meantime.
What is quickly to you? Is it 2025? Is it 2030? Is it 2050? You know, I
Oh
mean,
my
not
gosh.
everybody wants a benchmark, but what is quickly to you in your mind?
Fair enough. We were just talking about, hundreds of thousands of years.
800,000 years?
No, that's not quick. I think we can make huge change in a decade. I think we can be looking at a really different world and prospect within 10 years. The iPhone gets introduced and the world is a totally different place 10 years after that. Lots of things, new technologies and approaches get introduced, and people, think of how quickly the internet became important to our lives. 10, 20 years, and the whole way we do things can be completely different. And I think that's the kind of transition, and it's really opportunity and growth, right? That's the speed of change that you would need to really avert the most dangerous risks from the climate system.
I love how everything is connected, though. And what I mean by that is what you said. Honestly, us treating the earth a little bit better are the things that are, quite honestly, a little bit better for our health. Kind of makes a little bit of sense.
Yes.
All right. I don't have anything else for you, Dr. Strauss. Thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything else that you would like to discuss or mention before we go here?
No, this is great.